Right, good morning. This is session 9 of Between Jesus and Paul, and we're having a look at the discrepancies between the message, theology of Paul, and possibly that of the very early apostles, the ones that kind of walked and talked with Jesus. So in session 8, we elaborated on the book. We're busy with the book by James Tabor. He's very it's speculative explanation for the empty tomb and the resurrection, according to James Tabor. But I must say that even though if this is the first time you hear a theory like this, it might be a little bit upsetting. It could possibly even be a little bit offensive. But once you realize that you can't harmonize or force harmonize the New Testament Gospels, let's include Paul for now, you realize that almost everything is highly speculative. There's very, very little that we can pin down as highly probable from the New Testament Gospels. And there's a list of these things. We've dealt with some of them. But the reality is that when we stop harmonizing the sources and we take each source seriously for what it's saying independently, we have to find better ways to explain what has happened. And personally, I think at this point in my life, at least, I think James Tabor's explanation is one of the more plausible explanations of what happened in the resurrection. Saying that, we're moving on today to something a little less offensive, maybe, which is we're going to be sorting through the resurrection appearances. Now, if you've never done this exercise, I would strongly recommend that you go back to the New Testament Gospels, all 4 of them, and you read the resurrection appearances. In other words, what happens after the resurrection, and the sightings and appearances of Jesus, that you read them independently, that you write them down next to each other, and that you compare them with one another. And that you then resist the urge, the fundamental Christian urge, to harmonize and force harmonize them. And stand back and say, what are they saying independently? And this is basically what critical scholars do. They do not accept the harmonized univocality of the Bible, and they look at the sources independently. When you do this, you realize that there is, at the very best, strong tensions between the resurrection appearances as recorded for us by Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. We're going to include Paul in that. Strong tensions, many would argue contradictions. And so that's what we're going to have a look at today, is the sightings of Jesus, and we're going to try and sort through them. And what we're going to do, what historians typically do, and they sort through them, and they sort them in chronological order to see if they can pick up on a trend or a change over time in the story. Historians do not, by default, assume that everything written down is 100% true and correct, but they make the, I think, fundamental assumption that when people write things down, it is impossible to write something down outside of your own context. So, in other words, that which you believe, understand, and were exposed to influences how you write something down. And someone writing something down about a particular event today versus someone writing something down about that same event 50 years later, they're not going to write down the same word for word, of course, if they're independent, but at the same time, stories change over time. And so we can pick up on the changes in these stories over particular periods of time. So what we have in the Gospels, and we're going to include Paul here, is possibly between Paul and, let's say, something like Luke Acts, and maybe John as well, as we really have almost half a century between these two sources. That is a very, very long time in a period where a source could not be preserved by the internet or by sending an email or a voice message, and a lot of the people were actually illiterate. So the point is that we want to sort through the sightings and see if we can pick up on a particular pattern. Now, we also want to bring in one other gospel, which is called the Gospel of Peter. It's non-canonical. It wasn't included in the Bible. And if you ever have the time, Google it and go read it, and you'll understand why they might not have included it. It's got extravagant resurrection scenes in there. But James Tabor makes the point that in the Gospel of Peter, there's actually, which looks like two versions of the resurrection story. The first one is extravagant. I can't recall it 100%, but it's something like Jesus coming out as a big cross out of the grave, like higher than the clouds, something like that. It's visionary, like someone was hallucinating while they were writing it down. It's almost hard to think that the person writing this wasn't writing metaphorically. But and maybe for those reasons, amongst others, it wasn't included in the canonical in the canon. But there is another portion in there that records the resurrection appearances in a very similar way than Mark and Matthew. And that's the part we just want to have a look at a little bit. Obviously, Gospel of Peter is a 2nd century document. I'm not sure exactly how late in the 2nd century. Let's assume mid-2nd century, just for argument's sake. So we're talking about something a little bit later, another half a century possibly after something like John. Okay, so in the Gospel of Peter, which is written under Peter's name, Peter, pretty sure, couldn't write. So it's pseudographic, I think is the word. It's narrated. He narrates the resurrection account. It has a large portion of legendary and extravagant info. Scholars don't describe much historicity and reliability to this, but it seems to transmit two versions of the resurrection story. One fantastical, and the other one quite straightforward, realistic, almost. It has an historical feel. Now, the second seems almost identical to Mark's account, and I want to read that. Quoting, "Now it was the last day of the unleavened bread, and many went to their homes because the feast was at end." So this is about 8 days after Passover, which Jesus was crucified on Passover. So this is a week later. It says, "Many went to their homes because the feast had ended. But we, the 12 disciples of the Lord, we wept and we mourned, and each one we grieved for what had happened. We returned to our own homes. But I, Simon Peter, and my brother Andrew, we took our nets and we went to the sea. And there was with us Levi, the son of Alphaeus," possibly pointing towards Matthew. Okay, so let's just stop there. So in the Gospel of Peter, you have this account of the disciples mourning for a week the resurrection and then leaving back to Galilee to their homes. Now, this is very interesting because it seems to be overlapping quite well with what we have in Mark and possibly portions of Matthew. Here the disciples spend their time in Jerusalem. They mourn, they return home, back to fishing, which might ring a little bell. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then sometime later, they began to believe that Jesus was in fact resurrected. In other words, they did not become aware of the resurrection within the first week after Passover, but it happened at some later time. Now, you might say, but that's not what Luke said. I know, I'm not talking about Luke. We're not talking about John. We're talking about the Gospel of Peter. We're going to evaluate them independently. The body of Jesus, then, according to this, would have just rested in a tomb in Jerusalem. But there was no threat to their faith in his resurrection. It agrees with Mark that the disciples had to return to Galilee. Now, if you know the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to be running through it, this is what Mark has that's different to Luke and John at least, and Acts, is that it says that the disciples goes immediately back to Galilee, right? Where Luke says that they stayed in Jerusalem. They were ordered to stay in Jerusalem, and there they saw Jesus in his resurrected state, and there Jesus ascended. Well, Mark says, no, they went home. So the reason why we're bringing up the Gospel of Peter, because it has this portion that agrees with the earliest of our Gospels. What does that tell us? It's possible that this could have been a very persistent and strong tradition that the writer of the Gospel of Peter felt he couldn't leave out in order to try and convey the historical side of what happened. Okay, so strangely enough, we have a version of the story that's also tagged onto the Gospel of John. So at the end of the Gospel of John, John 21, we find a story here that is very similar to the Gospel of Peter, where Peter returns to fishing when they see Jesus, and it's there when they see Jesus. which is a very strong, a strange little portion at the end of John, because you have in John the resurrection, all the disciples see him, they experience him. Thomas puts his hands in the wounds, and then Peter and Andrew goes back to fishing. What the heck? What's going on? Most probably two different traditions. So what James Tabor is saying is that what we have in the Gospel of Peter, that portion, what we have at the end of the book of John, and what we have in Mark is actually one persistent, earliest, if you like, tradition about what happened around the resurrection. So Matthew follows Mark. This we know, it's pretty much accepted by most of scholarship that Matthew basically has Mark in front of him when he's writing, and therefore Matthew does follow Mark in most of the narrative, at least, and then adds on things as you can see for yourself. But Matthew follows Mark with the emphasis on the disciples returning to Galilee as the place where they saw Jesus first. So when it comes to the disciples, what we have is we start with the least reliable. Gospel of Peter has the disciples go back to Galilee, right? Then we jump across John, and we don't jump across John. John has a little piece tagged onto the end where it says that Peter and Andrew went back to Galilee and they started fishing again. Right, that's weird because it feels like in tension with John itself, right? Then we go to Luke. Luke doesn't have anything like that. In Luke, the disciples stay in Jerusalem. We go back to Matthew and Mark. We have a definitive answer here. The disciples go back to Galilee because that's what they were told to do by the angel or by the man sitting in the tomb, and that's also what Jesus told them to do. So James patches this together and says, look, wait a minute, what we have here is a very earliest tradition in Mark, carried over into Matthew, completely seemingly ignored by Luke, ignored by John, but tagged onto the end of John, and then it surfaces again in something as late as the Gospel of Peter. What we're dealing with here is a persistent tradition, which I can't remember the exact term, but if something like this, which actually seems to contradict later ideas, persists, it is a sign that it is most possibly very reliable. Anyway, so Matthew follows Mark in this emphasis on the disciples going back to Galilee. You can read that in Matthew 25:16-17. He mentions a specific mountain where they saw him worshipped, right? But some they then doubted. So many scholars believe, this is a bit besides the point, but it is interesting if you're interested in this stuff. A lot of scholars believe that the transfiguration in Mark 9 is actually misplaced as the actual appearance of Jesus. So in other words, they believe that this portion was the actual appearance of Jesus on that mountain after the resurrection, and it was misplaced in Mark for what reason I don't want to go into at the moment. Leave that aside. Obviously, Matthew following Mark, Matthew places us exactly where Mark had placed it. So when we place these sources in the chronological order, a very interesting development arises, and this is what we want to have a look at today. And here's a summary of the resurrection appearances if we go from earliest source to latest source. All right, and you can go check me out. You can go read this for yourself. You don't have to take my word for it. Now, in Mark, there are no resurrection appearances, right? The last portion of Mark is pretty well established. That was written and added later. Mark ends, I can never remember exactly, is it 16 verse 9 or 16 verse 20? I can't remember, but it ends like this. And the women flee, they were afraid, and they fled, and they told no one. Right, so they get to an empty tomb. There's a person sitting in the tomb talking to them, saying something about going back to Galilee. They flee, they're afraid, they tell no one. That's how Mark ends. But I've skipped Paul. Let me just jump back to Paul for a moment. Paul has a revelation about Christ 7 years after the crucifixion. He claims that he saw Jesus in what we have now discussed to be some type of spiritual body, not a flesh and blood body. Twice then in 1 Corinthians, he equates his experience with that of Peter, the disciples, James, and then he mentions a 500 that was at some point experienced Jesus as well. And he does this based on a tradition that he has received. Right, so James, as I said, so last of all, he then says he also had this experience of Jesus. He gives no locations. Paul doesn't dabble in what happened where. No locations, but he does mention the 12, and possibly at this point Judas was already replaced. All right, so that's all we really have from Paul. When we go to Mark, Mark has no account of anyone seeing Jesus, but a young man just tells the woman to go wait in Galilee, right? That's all we get from Mark. So Mark has no, and I'm going to keep on showing you the contrast because it's easy to not see the contrast if you're used to harmonizing all the accounts. Mark says nothing about Jesus appearing in and around Jerusalem. Mark says nothing about an ascension from just outside Jerusalem. Mark only says or indicates that they have to go back to Galilee. There they will experience Jesus, or there they will meet with him, right? Now, Matthew obviously follows Mark, but Matthew adds a little bit on. Matthew relates that it was the woman who saw the empty tomb, same as Mark, and was told that they will see Jesus in Galilee. This also feels like a slight development, but still intact with what Mark puts forward. Now, in Matthew, as the women run, they actually meet Jesus, and he then tells them, "Go tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." So when we're talking about Jesus's appearance to the disciples, Matthew and Mark are quite clear that this has to happen in Galilee, right? This has to happen in Galilee. This is in Matthew 28:10. Then, of course, in Matthew 28:10, they do see him. And when they see him, when they have this experience on a mountain, is what Matthew says, some of them doubt it. Okay, so some say that this is could have been what we actually read in Mark 9, the transfiguration could actually have been this experience they had there. Very visionary, according to Mark doesn't say anything about what type of experience, but the Matthew experience seems to be quite visionary. Or at least there's no explicit mention of him eating or drinking or people touching him or putting their fingers in his wounds or anything like that. Him walking through a wall and that type of, there's nothing like that we get. Now we go to Luke. And here in Luke, something changes. Let's see what Luke says. Luke writes that on the first Sunday, this is the Sunday of the resurrection, right? Men walked and they saw Jesus in Jerusalem. And they didn't recognize him, which is weird, very weird, right? Why are they not recognizing Jesus? I mean, you know it's Jesus. Why aren't you recognizing him? But Jesus then also appears to Peter later that evening. So here we have a very strong tension with Mark and with Matthew that Luke explicitly states Jesus actually does appear to Peter in Jerusalem later that evening, and the other 11. So the explicit information from Luke is that Jesus does appear to the disciples in Jerusalem, the 11, or Peter and the other 11. And of course, Luke has the emphasis on a physical body with flesh and bones, convincing. He does things to convince them that he's not a ghost. We don't find this type of thing in Matthew, Mark, or in Paul, the earliest stuff. And this all happens in Luke on the first day in Jerusalem. Okay, if you read a little bit further, do a bit more inspection, you'll see that the disciples are told not to leave Jerusalem, but they've got to wait there for the infilling of the Holy Spirit. This is a very strong tension, and I would go as far to say it's a contradiction with what Matthew and Mark puts on the table for us. Luke, of course, likes to write about the temple, and if you the theological emphasis of Luke is on Jesus as prophet, who is crucified because he told the truth and said the truth, but everything happens around the temple in Jerusalem. Okay, let's move on to John. So John says that Jesus first appears to Mary on Sunday morning outside the tomb. Okay, so, that feels a bit like possibly Mark, possibly Matthew, and later that evening also to the disciples. So that includes what Luke put on the table, right? And there he showed them his wounds, and this is where Thomas then is not present. And then 8 days later, now, okay, so John is, you could say, okay, no, Luke, Jesus just appeared on the first day in Jerusalem with Luke, and then they went back to Galilee. We know that's not true according to Luke, but John goes one further. He doesn't only have appearances on the first day, on the Sunday. He has 8 days later. Jesus is still in Jerusalem. The disciples are still in Jerusalem. And this is where Thomas puts his hand in the wounds, and blessed is he who believes without seeing. Now, in this little end that's tagged onto John in John 21, a lot of scholars believe that John 21 was added later. I'm not sure if there's really proof for that, but it surely, when you examine the resurrection appearance, it starts feeling like it's a different tradition being tagged and paralleled or put onto John's actual writing. We find this a lot in the Bible. If you start studying, it's everywhere. It's multiple sources coming together at later stages. So the appendix to John, he calls it the appendix to John 21, relates an unconnected account, and it's unconnected, but it is connected to Peter, Gospel of Peter. It is connected to ideas we find in Matthew and Mark, right? In Galilee, Jesus appears to Peter while he's busy fishing, and others, and eats with him, and then they go back to fishing. So, as a pastor, I always explain the story as the disciples saw Jesus in Jerusalem resurrected, and then they didn't know what to do, and they lost hope, and they didn't, they were disillusioned, and they went back to what they were used to doing. I no longer hold that view, because that's a forced harmonization of these gospels. What really is going on here is two traditions, it seems, that this is an older, more persistent tradition that they actually did go back to Galilee and did go back to fishing before they understood Jesus as resurrected, and there they encountered him. All right. The Bible is a confluence of many, many sources, traditions coming together, edited, redacted. Once you realize that, you can start understanding it for the first time. I really believe that. Now, we move on. After John, we've mentioned this Gospel of Peter. Here, the disciples, they stay there for 1 week. There's no resurrection appearances. They return to Galilee. And even though they find the empty tomb, the disciples have no faith that Jesus has been resurrected. And we find this in John as well. Like, when I think it's Mary, when she gets to the empty tomb and she finds it, her first response is not hallelujah, resurrection. Her first response is, they've moved his body. And we spoke about that last week. This is not proof of a resurrection. It wasn't to Mary. An empty tomb is not the proof of a resurrection, unfortunately. It's just, okay, not too much more about that. So in the Gospel of Peter, they return back to fishing. All right, so this is the sources on the resurrection appearances in chronological order. This spans about, let's say, 100 years almost. That's a long time, guys. So there are two very big observations we can make from breaking down the sources and reading them in this chronological order without presupposing their harmonization. The earlier texts, like Mark and Matthew, they agree that the disciples encountered Jesus in Galilee only, sometime after the empty tomb was discovered. They are told to go to Galilee, where they will see him. Since they would not have left before the 8th day, right? Because as a Jew, you have to stay there for 8 days. Passover is 8 days long. They wouldn't have returned to Galilee over the Passover. After 8 days, they would have started walking. Galilee is not close to Jerusalem if you're walking, right? It takes, I didn't do the homework on this, I'm so sorry, but it's pretty far. Like you won't get there in a day or two. James Saber is writing here, he says several weeks, right? So I'm not sure how long it would take you to walk from Galilee to, from Jerusalem to Galilee, but it's a little bit besides the point, really, whether it's 2 weeks or 1 week. The point, let's say 1 week for argument's sake. The point is that for the first 2 weeks, the disciples, according to Matthew and Mark, have not encountered a resurrected Jesus, and most possibly, does not believe in the resurrection as yet. Right? So, since they would have not left before the 8th day, they had to walk very far. Matthew's account is a more visionary, and it's subject to doubt. This is the appearing at the mountain. Why is it subject to doubt? I mean, he's putting this forth, James Saber is putting this forth, that if if it was clear body, physical body appearance, there's no doubt, right? If someone is already dead, like my dad appeared next to me and I can touch him, the doubt leaves me of who this is. I know who this is. I might not understand why he's here, but there's no doubt as to who it is. But there's always doubt as to who Jesus is in almost all the Gospels, which lends itself towards that these experiences were more visionary and spiritual, if you like, than what they were physical flesh and body experiences. And that might, and we're going to say, we'll get to why then is Luke and John so intent on showing physical eating, walking? Why are they making that change to the Matthew, Mark, and as we've seen now, really the Pauline tradition? So Matthew's account is more visionary, subject to doubt. The Gospel of Peter and the appendix to John indicates that Peter and the others returned to their homes. Peter and Andrew went back to fishing, right? Now, the later accounts of Luke and John places Jesus' appearances in Jerusalem. This is a strong tension. As immediate, on the same day, and some even a little bit later, Jesus appears as a flesh and blood human, demonstrating that he is not a ghost or a spirit. Like it's almost trying to get away from the idea that it could have been visionary, right? The strong impression one gets is that in the later sources, the empty tomb is deliberately connected to the immediate appearances, reflecting the idea of the resurrection of a literal corpse. So the point that James makes here, and a lot of scholars make this point, is that the change we see between Mark, Matthew, Paul, and Luke and John is that Luke and John seems to be in reaction to something when they change from what seems to be very Galilean visionary to Jerusalem on the day with an empty tomb bodily experience. Why is there a transition between these two sources? Why do they groups of sources? Why do they differ in such? Why is actually Luke in almost 100% tension when it comes to where and what? And the answer for James, at least here, James Tabor, is that they seem to be deliberately connecting an empty tomb with immediate appearances, and flesh and blood. Right? These dichotomies are quite striking. Did Jesus appear first to the disciples in Jerusalem or Galilee? Was it immediate or was it later? Was it visionary spiritual experiences or was it literal flesh and blood bodies? The internal evidence is decisively then in favor of Mark Matthew tradition, which fits quite well with Paul. And so James Tabor lands here on his conclusion. His conclusion is that Jesus did not appear in Jerusalem to the disciples. There were no flesh and body appearances like reported in Luke and John, that those were later adaptations of the earliest, more reliable traditions, which were Jesus, the disciples mourned Jesus in Jerusalem and left. And once they were back in Galilee, they had a visionary experience of the resurrected Jesus. Some doubted because that's what visionary experiences do. And that's where the tradition started, that Jesus had resurrected. After that, they returned to Jerusalem, etc., etc. Okay. So, to imagine that the stories of Luke and John circulated, this little thought experiment, think about, or try to imagine that the stories of Luke and John circulated when Mark wrote his gospel. This is highly improbable. It's highly improbable that Mark, knowing about a tradition of experiences in Jerusalem and them being physical on the same day, that he would have just left this out. It's highly, highly improbable. It's not the best explanation for what's going on. The best explanation is that Luke and John are later developed traditions. There's another dichotomy I haven't spoken about here even, is the ascension, where the ascension takes place. I think Matthew speaks about an ascension out from Galilee because that's where it all happened. But Luke, of course, has the ascension just outside of Jerusalem. And Luke is the one who says, he actually has a bodily ascension, like Jesus goes as a flesh and blood human, resurrected human, up in the sky and says he will come back exactly as he goes up. He's going to come back exactly the same way. It's just out of step with what we find in Paul and Mark and Matthew. All right, that's the point. That's the point. To imagine that these stories of Luke and John and even Acts, when I say Luke, I also often mean Acts because we believe it was the same writer, that they were in circulation, early traditions that Mark just ignored or didn't feel like writing down or didn't know about. It's just highly improbable that Mark could publish the first gospel without appearances, with the focus on Galilee and not Jerusalem, pushes our evidence decidedly in the favor of the Galilean option, right? It is also hard to imagine that a later work like the Gospel of Peter would preserve a return to Galilee after the morning out in Jerusalem, unless it was a strong and a persistent tradition that this actually happened. What we have in the Gospels is a series of theologically motivated traditions, written decades after the event, removed from both place and time, and they offer us competing stories of what happened after Jesus died. They cannot and they should not be harmonized. I'd rather say they should not be harmonized, because if you're intent on a priori position that they are harmonized based on some theological dogma, then you'll find a way, right? It's going to be ridiculous, but you will find it. They shouldn't be harmonized. For this reason, Paul is a decisive first-hand witness. He would have found the emphasis on flesh and blood meaningless. Jesus' own teaching also emphasizes an angelic-like transformation. So why does the shift from Galilee to Jerusalem happen in the first place in Luke and John? Why would a writer do this? And why they attempt to connect the empty tomb with immediate appearances in Jerusalem, like that of a resuscitated corpse? Because you start getting the idea of a resuscitated corpse in Luke. Let's talk about Luke at least. Eating and then going up in the air, back up, and it creates a lot of problems, because if Jesus still has flesh and blood, like a normal human being, and he goes up in the air, where does he actually go? Paul doesn't have that problem, because he doesn't believe that Jesus is flesh and blood. He believes it's spiritual now, whatever spirit meant for those times. But it creates a lot of problems. Like, where's Jesus right now? It's one of the things I could really never get my head around as a believing Christian, believing that Jesus was flesh and blood, resurrected, walking around, and then went up in heaven. Where is he? Because, we've gone out in space, and there's nothing beyond us. We know the speed of light, and there's nothing around us that we could say, oh, well, there he is. So Paul's explanation actually works a little bit better, unless you take the Latter-day Saints explanation, which Jesus actually with God somewhere on another planet, watching us and controlling things from there, which I think most Christians don't really take. So anyway, why does the shift take place in Luke and John? The reason James Tabor puts forward is that it's an apologetic. In other words, apologetic in writing is to explain something or to combat something. These texts come late in the first century, possibly even early second century, and they were increasingly coming under the pressures of sophisticated Greek critics, because as Christianity grew, it became mostly Gentile, which meant Greco-Roman. And as you infiltrate Greco-Roman sphere with this idea of resurrection, you start to face more and more Greco-Roman criticism of what's going on, right? So Mark and Matthew's versions of the resurrection could easily have been brushed aside as just an hallucination, right? Someone comes to me today, I had a vision of Jesus. I would say, oh, that's excellent. But it was most probably not Jesus. It was most probably an hallucination or a dream or a daytime vision, right? That's a completely different thing. In other words, Greeks could have easily have said, look, you guys, I'm sorry, but these are just hallucinations you're having. Mass hallucinations can happen. Some people believe they can't, but I think it's quite well established that mass hallucinations can actually happen. And would have been even easy for a Greek philosopher to say to a Christian, look, you guys just hallucinated this stuff. If Mark and Matthew tradition is all they had, and even Paul's tradition. So it seems like, and it's at least it's put forward as plausible, that Luke and John write in um, response to this criticism and try and show that Jesus, no, it wasn't a vision or a dream or a hallucination. It was an actual Jesus, flesh and blood, eating, walking Jesus that goes up in the air. And Luke has a physical ascension. Matthew's ascension is, it's an ascension, but Luke's ascension says, in the same way as you see him go up, so he will also come down. Luke puts that emphasis on, right? This is physical. It's tangible. It's not a dream. It's not a vision. It's not an hallucination. Um, so Luke gives us our only scene in which Jesus ascends bodily from earth on the Mount of Olives just outside of Jerusalem, which is a flat-out contradiction with Matthew, right? This is in Acts 1, 9 to 10. And John said that Jesus ascended to where he was before. And this is obviously the theme of John, as Jesus as a logos from God coming down and then going back to prepare a place for all of us. And they leave him then as a bodily resurrected person. Leaving him as a bodily resurrected person was susceptible to the idea that he might just have died again. Like if you, let's pretend there's a Greek or Roman philosopher and you said, no, Jesus was bodily. He bodily came back to life and he ate with us and all everything. And then they'll ask you, all right, so where's he now? And you say, no, he ascended. Because if you don't, they'll ask, oh, he probably just died again. And that's what happens to people who resurrect. And the Greco-Romans have many stories like this of this type of thing happening, but the people die again. So Luke's bodily resurrection is the bodily resurrection, and the bodily ascension solves a lot of problems for Christians in terms of scrutiny of, well, where is he? How did it happen? Oh, you guys are just dreaming it. You were just hallucinating it. So this is the way in which James Tabor suggests that Luke and John were highly apologetic, and that's the reason why they make this massive shift from Paul, Mark, Matthew into the Luke, John tradition. Right, so these New Testament books, they take us decades beyond Paul, right? To understand Paul, we need to put the Gospels aside. And this is the reason why, when you want to truly understand Paul, you can't read him in terms of the later Gospels. They were not first. Paul was first. And of course, our study is about Paul. So this is one of the ways in which we understand that we need to, if we want to understand the resurrection in its earliest understanding, we have to go back to the first source we have, and this is Paul. Paul transformed Christianity into a new type of religion that claimed to supersede the old by moving everything from earthly to heavenly. In other words, in this case, what is being implied here is that Luke and John actually take us 2-3 steps back into the earthly, which is very Jewish. But for Paul, this thing becomes spiritual. It's a spiritual family that is born. It's not physical. It's remade completely. This transformation, it's completely different. Same essence, but spiritual, not physical. All right, I'll leave you that for session 9. The next session is about Paul himself. And if I wanted to be blunt, I could call this Paul's ego, because this session will focus on what did Paul think about his own experience and his own beliefs. How did he see himself? And we're going to be looking at Paul's writing and looking specifically for parts where Paul gives uniqueness to what he believed, where he got it from. And a lot of this is lost for us as Christians because we read Paul's letters like it's written for us. Like when Paul says, I can do anything, we put ourselves in there, right? That's how we read it. But that doesn't mean that's how Paul wrote it. And to take Paul more plainly and more seriously, we got to assume that when he says, I can do all things, he really means I, right? It's a stupid example, but there's a lot of portions that we have to re-examine to get behind the understanding of who Paul really is how humble he really was. What did he think about himself and what he believed? We'll do that in the next session. Thanks, guys. Cheers.